You have 30 days to get rid of these disgusting, filthy animals, or I will personally see to it that this board fines you into foreclosure. This is a respectable community, not a third-world pigsty, and your stench is a violation of our collective right to a pleasant living environment. The woman's voice was a grating symphony of entitlement and cheap perfume, a sound that seemed to physically curdle the humid morning air. Her name was Karen, a fact I knew only because the oversized rhinestone-encrusted name tag pinned to her floral blouse announced it to the world. She stood on the edge of my property line, her considerable frame planted as if she were claiming new territory, her arms crossed so tightly over her chest that her fists were white. Behind her, a pristine white SUV was parked haphazardly on the pristine asphalt of Creekwood Estates, its engine still humming, a loyal chariot for this self-appointed queen. My two goats, Pat and Benatar, merely blinked at her from their pasture, their nonchalant chewing a perfect counterpoint to her apoplectic rage. I leaned against the weathered split-rail fence that had stood on this land for 50 years, long before the first foundation was ever poured for her cookie-cutter kingdom, and took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The steam warmed my face as I studied her. She was everything my drill sergeant had warned me about in civilian life, a tyrant with a tiny kingdom, armed with a binder of rules and an unshakable belief in her own authority. The financial threat was laughable, but the sheer unadulterated audacity of it, the way she stood there and decreed the fate of my home, my land, my animals, that lit a fuse deep inside me, a slow-burning one I hadn't felt since my last tour. If you've ever had a run-in with an HOA that made your blood boil, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from or share your own HOA nightmare. It's a strange and frustrating club to be in, but trust me, you are not alone. Now let me tell you how this particular queen's reign came to a rather abrupt and satisfying end. To understand the full, beautiful irony of Karen's threat, you have to understand this land. It wasn't just a 10-acre plot I'd bought on a whim. It was the last remaining piece of my grandfather's original 200-acre farm. He'd bought it after the war, the second one, with nothing but a GI loan and a belief that a man's soul needed dirt under his fingernails to stay grounded. He'd raised cattle, my father, and hell in that order. When the developers came sniffing around in the late 90s, their briefcases full of cash and blueprints for a place they wanted to call Creekwood Estates, my grandfather was old and tired. He sold them 190 acres, but he held this piece back. A man's got to have a place to hear himself think, he told me, his hand resting on the very fence post I was leaning against. They can have the fields, but they can't have the heart. I inherited that heart when he passed, and with it, a promise to keep it alive. After 20 years as an Army combat engineer, building and breaking things in places I'd rather forget, all I wanted was to come back to this heart, to this piece of dirt, and build something that would last. My wife Sarah and I didn't have a big operation, just a few rescue animals. The goats, a handful of chickens, and an old horse named Gunner with a bad leg and a gentle soul. It was a sanctuary, for them and for us. Our property was zoned agricultural long before Creekwood Estates was even a gleam in a developer's eye. We weren't part of their HOA. We weren't bound by their rules about lawn height, mailbox color, or, as it turned out, the supposed olfactory offense of happy, healthy livestock. Karen, in her righteous fury, had made a critical error. She had assumed I was just another subject in her suburban fiefdom. She hadn't bothered to do her homework. She hadn't looked at the county plat maps. She hadn't checked the zoning records, and she certainly hadn't examined the fine print on the deed for her own oversized beige house. And that lack of due diligence was going to be her undoing. I finished my coffee, the ceramic mug warm in my hands, and gave her a calm, even smile. "Ma'am," I said, my voice low and steady, "I appreciate you sharing your opinion. I'll give it all the consideration it deserves." Her face already a mottled pink, deep into a shade of crimson I hadn't seen outside of a Crayola box. She sputtered, speechless for a moment before finding her voice again. "This isn't an opinion, it's a fact. This is a formal notice. You will comply, or you will face the consequences." She spun on her heel and marched back to her SUV, the gravel crunching under her sensible flats. As she drove away, I looked over at Gunner, who'd ambled over to the fence. I stroked his graying muzzle. "Well, buddy," I murmured, "looks like the new neighbor wants to start a war." He just swished his tail, completely unbothered. That was the thing about this land. It had a way of putting things in perspective. Wars came and went, kings and queens rose and fell, but the land endured. And I was its steward. This wasn't just my home. It was a legacy. And I would defend it with the same methodical, unyielding precision I'd once used to clear minefields. Karen had just stepped on a pressure plate she didn't even know was there. The first official salvo in Karen's war arrived a week later, delivered by a certified mail carrier who looked deeply apologetic, as if he knew he was delivering a parcel of pure misery. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope embossed with the Creekwood Estates HOA logo, a stylized oak tree that looked more like a corporate branding attempt than anything found in nature. Inside, a multi-page document, printed on heavy cardstock, detailed my transgressions in florid pseudo-legal language. I was in violation of Bylaw 17.4, Maintenance of Aesthetically Pleasing Environments, and Bylaw 22.1, Prohibition of Noxious Odors and Activities. The letter claimed that no fewer than multiple concerned residents had lodged formal complaints about the overpowering and unsanitary stench emanating from my property, which was allegedly causing significant emotional distress and a quantifiable decline in property values. The initial fine was $500, with a stern warning that it would double every 30 days I remained in noncompliance. My favorite part was the addendum, a grainy, zoomed-in photo of Pat the goat mid-chew, circled in red ink with the caption, "Exhibit A, Source of Contamination." I had to laugh. Sarah, my wife, read it over my shoulder, her expression shifting from amusement to annoyance. "Can they actually do this?" she asked, her hand resting on my arm. "We're not even in their HOA." I spread the documents out on our heavy oak dining table, the same table my grandfather had built. "They can try," I said, my voice calm. "This isn't a legal document, Sarah. It's a scare tactic. It's the first move in a game of psychological warfare." I spent the next hour in my office pulling out my own files. The original deed to the land, crisp and clear. The county zoning documents, which explicitly designated my 10 acres as agricultural residential, exempting it from precisely the kind of suburban covenants Karen was trying to enforce. I even had the original master plan for the Creekwood development, showing my parcel clearly marked as pre-existing, non-participating. My case was airtight. This was an open and shut matter of jurisdiction. I drafted a polite professional email to the HOA board, attaching scanned copies of all the relevant documents. I explained, in simple, unambiguous terms, that my property was not and had never been part of Creekwood Estates, and therefore their bylaws and fines were inapplicable. I respectfully requested they cease all further communication and retract the violation notice. I hit send and felt a sense of closure. I had presented the facts. The matter was resolved. That assumption, I would soon learn, was tragically naive. I had treated it like a logical problem, but I was dealing with an emotional one. I was dealing with Karen. Her reply came less than an hour later. It was a masterpiece of condescension. "Mr. Thompson," it began, "while we appreciate your historical documents, the reality is that your property directly abuts our community. The agricultural designation is an archaic loophole that common decency and modern community standards should override. Your actions directly impact the lives and investments of our residents. The board has reviewed your evidence and finds it irrelevant to the matter at hand, which is the public nuisance you are creating. The fine stands. In fact, due to your argumentative and uncooperative response, we are invoking Bylaw 3.7 for insubordination to board directives and adding a second fine of $500. Your new total is $1,000, due in 30 days. Further correspondence of this nature will only result in additional penalties." I read the email twice, then a third time, the words blurring into a crimson haze of rage. Archaic loophole? Irrelevant? This wasn't about a smell or a bylaw. This was a power trip. She was a petty dictator who couldn't stand the existence of a single square foot of land beyond her control. The fact that my property was a visible, daily reminder of her limited authority was an insult she simply could not abide. That was the moment my strategy shifted. This was no longer a misunderstanding to be cleared up with paperwork. This was a deliberate, malicious attack. My training kicked in. When faced with an aggressor who refuses to de-escalate, you don't retreat. You dig in, you fortify your position, and you prepare for a protracted engagement. I opened a new folder on my computer desktop, Operation Pasture Storm. I created a spreadsheet logging the date, time, and content of every piece of communication. I saved Karen's email as a PDF. I printed a hard copy and placed it in a 3-ring binder, the first page in what would become a very, very thick volume of evidence. Then I went online and ordered 4 high-resolution night vision security cameras. 2 would be aimed at the fence line she'd stood at, one at my driveway and one covering the barn and animal pens. If Karen wanted a war of documentation, I was going to bury her in it. I was an engineer. I understood systems. I understood stress points and load-bearing walls. And I was starting to see the cracks in the foundation of Karen's little empire. She thought her binder of rules was her greatest weapon. She had no idea that my greatest weapon was patience, precision, and a deep, abiding respect for the fine print. The fines, as threatened, began to multiply. The official letters kept coming, each one more unhinged than the last. I was fined $200 for an unapproved fence, the very same weathered split rail that had marked my family's land for half a century. I received another $300 violation for improper storage of agricultural equipment, which referred to my grandfather's lovingly restored 1953 Ford Jubilee tractor that I kept parked near the barn. My personal favorite was the $500 penalty for visual nuisance, citing the unappealing and rustic nature of the barn structure. A beautiful post and beam building, my dad and I had re-roofed ourselves 10 years prior. I photographed each letter, logged it in my spreadsheet, and filed it neatly in the binder, which was now starting to feel satisfyingly heavy. I never responded. Arguing with Karen was like wrestling a pig in mud. You both get dirty, and the pig likes it. My silence, I suspected, was driving her even crazier than a debate would have. While the official assault continued via the U.S. Postal Service, Karen opened a new front in the digital realm. A neighbor I was on friendly terms with, a quiet guy named Mark who lived 3 houses down from Karen, sent me a string of screenshots from the private Creekwood Estates Facebook group. It was a cesspool of suburban paranoia, and I was the star attraction. Karen had posted a long, rambling tirade about the uncooperative farmer on their border. She painted me as a hostile, defiant hillbilly, intentionally polluting their air and thumbing my nose at their community values. "He thinks his old papers make him special," one of her posts read. "But our property values are dropping every day because of his arrogance. We need to stand together and show him that our community will not be intimidated." The comments section was a mix of support for her and a few timid questions. "Are we sure he's legally part of the HOA?" one brave soul asked, only to be immediately shouted down by Karen's loyalists. "It doesn't matter. It's about basic decency," one replied. "My kids can't even play in the backyard because of the smell," another lied. It was a classic campaign of misinformation and social pressure, designed to isolate me and turn the entire neighborhood against me. Some of it was working. I noticed a few of the residents who used to wave as they jogged past my property now looked away, their faces tight. The harassment escalated from paper and pixels to the physical world one Thursday evening. I went out for the late-night check on the animals, my boots crunching on the gravel path. Everything seemed quiet until I reached the water trough for Gunner and the goats. The water level was dangerously low, and the surface was slick with a weird, oily sheen. The automatic float valve that kept it full had been jammed shut with a small, deliberately placed rock. My blood ran cold. This wasn't about a fine for a rustic barn anymore. This was a direct threat to the well-being of my animals. They could have been without water for hours in the summer heat. I checked them over immediately. Thankfully, they seemed okay, just thirsty. I fixed the valve, my hands shaking with a fury I hadn't felt in a very long time. Back inside, I pulled up the footage from the new security cameras. The one pointed at the barn had caught something. Around 10 p.m., a figure dressed in dark clothing, their face obscured by a hoodie, had quickly slipped over the fence, tampered with the trough, and slipped back out. The image was grainy, the person's build and gait maddeningly generic. It wasn't enough for a positive ID, but I knew it was a message. The next morning, I filed a report with the county sheriff's department for trespassing and attempted animal cruelty. The deputy who responded was professional but realistic. "Without a clear face, there's not much we can do," he said, looking at the footage on my monitor. "But you've got a formal report now. It establishes a pattern." He was right. This was a crucial piece of evidence. Karen, or one of her disciples, had crossed a bright red line. They had moved from bureaucratic bullying to criminal action. The binder was no longer just about defending myself from fines. It was about building a case. As the deputy left, I stood on my porch and looked across the fields toward the neat rows of houses. The game had changed. My goal was no longer just to get Karen to leave me alone. My new goal was to dismantle her entire operation. It was time to call in reinforcements. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in a few years. "Dave, it's Marcus." "Yeah, it's been a while. Listen, I need your help. I've got a situation here, and it's right up your alley. How soon can you see me? I'll bring the paperwork." The drive to Dave Riley's law office in the city felt like a mission briefing. The binder, now nearly 3 inches thick and weighing at least 10 pounds, sat on the passenger seat like a tactical briefcase. Dave and I had served together in the 299th Engineer Battalion. We'd built bridges under fire in places that weren't on any tourist map. He was calm, meticulous, and had a mind that could see weaknesses in structures, whether they were made of steel or legal arguments. After his tour, he'd traded his combat boots for wingtips and gone to law school, specializing in property and land use law. He was exactly the ally I needed. His office was on the 12th floor of a glass and steel tower, a world away from my dusty farm. But when he came out to greet me, he was the same old Dave, with a firm handshake and eyes that missed nothing. "Marcus, you old dog," he grinned. "You look good. Farm life agrees with you." "It did until about a month ago," I said, holding up the binder. "I brought you some light reading." In his conference room, I laid it all out. I started with the picture of the land, my grandfather's legacy. I walked him through the development of Creekwood Estates, showing him the maps. Then I unveiled Karen's letters, one by one, followed by the screenshots from the Facebook group, and finally the police report in the grainy image of the trespasser. Dave listened without interruption, his fingers steepled, his expression growing progressively darker. He read Karen's emails, a muscle twitching in his jaw. When I finished, he was silent for a full minute, slowly turning the pages in the binder. "Marcus, this is textbook," he finally said, his voice low and tight. "Harassment, malicious prosecution by a private entity, slander. She's running her HOA like a tin pot dictatorship. The case for a countersuit is a slam dunk. We can get an injunction to stop the fines and sue them for damages and legal fees. We'll bleed their insurance company dry." "That's good," I said. "That's the defensive plan. But I told you I wanted to go on the offensive. There's something else." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out another, much older file folder. The paper yellowed with age. I slid a single document across the polished mahogany table. "My grandfather was a shrewd man," I explained. "When he sold the 190 acres to the developers, he didn't sell it all as fee simple. He was worried about the character of the neighborhood changing. So for 5 of the primest lots, the ones with the best views right up against his property line, he structured the deal differently. He didn't sell the land, he leased it." Dave picked up the document. His eyes, trained to devour fine print, scanned the page. A slow, predatory grin spread across his face. "A 99-year land lease," he breathed almost reverently. "I haven't seen one of these in years. They're ironclad." He looked up at me, his eyes gleaming. "Don't tell me." "Her house," I said, letting the words hang in the air. "Lot 42, the one with the big bay window and the perfectly manicured HOA-approved petunias. That's Karen's house, and her name is on this lease as the current tenant." Dave leaned back in his chair, a low whistle escaping his lips. He looked at the lease again, his finger tracing a line down to the signature block. "Executed in 1925. Good for 99 years. Which means—" He did the math in his head, his eyes widening. "Marcus, This lease expires in 6 months. The air in the room suddenly felt electric. This was the ace I'd been holding, the ultimate trump card. A land lease is fundamentally different from a mortgage. With a mortgage, you own the house and the land it sits on. With a land lease, you own the building, but you are effectively a long-term renter of the ground beneath it. And when the lease is up, the landowner is under no obligation to renew. The terms are specific, I continued, my voice steady. Section 12, paragraph B. Upon termination or non-renewal of the lease, the lessee has 60 days to remove all personal property and structures from the land at their own expense. If the structures are not removed, they are considered forfeit and become the property of the landowner. Dave let out a short, sharp laugh. So this woman, who is trying to fine you into foreclosure for the smell of your goats, is living in a house that she will legally be required to move or surrender in 6 months on land that you own. That's the strategic situation, counselor, I said, a grim smile touching my lips for the first time that day. So what's our plan of attack? Dave leaned forward, all business now. It's a two-pronged assault. Phase 1, we file a blistering countersuit against the HOA and name Karen personally as a co-defendant for her targeted harassment. We'll bury them in discovery requests. We'll demand depositions. We'll get that injunction. That puts them on the defensive and bleeds their resources. Phase 2, he said, tapping the ancient lease agreement, is the kill shot. We do nothing with this yet. We wait. The lease requires 180 days notice for non-renewal. We will serve her that notice on the exact day required, not a day sooner. We let her continue her crusade. We let her dig her own grave a little deeper. And then, when she feels most powerful, we pull the rug out from under her entire world. It was a brilliant, ruthless plan, and it was exactly what she deserved. Armed with a legal strategy, my next step was to build a coalition. A single voice yelling in the wilderness is easily dismissed as a crackpot, but a chorus of voices is a movement. I knew I couldn't be the only person who had suffered under Karen's reign. My first stop was Mark, the neighbor who had sent me the Facebook screenshots. I met him at a coffee shop in the next town over, a neutral location where we wouldn't be seen. I laid out my binder, showing him the fines, the letters, and the police report. He wasn't surprised. She's a nightmare, he said, stirring his latte. Last year, she tried to fine my family because my son's bicycle, which he left in our driveway for 2 hours, wasn't a pre-approved color. We had to paint a perfectly good bike black to get her to drop it. He told me about others. The Millers, an elderly couple on a fixed income, who were forced to pay a contractor $2,000 to resod their lawn because of a single brown patch during a drought. The Garcias, who were fined weekly until they took down their daughter's swing set because the vibrant yellow plastic was deemed visually disruptive. Karen ruled by fear, picking off residents one by one, knowing they wouldn't risk a costly fight over something seemingly small, but the small things added up. The problem, Mark said, his voice low, is the rest of the board. They're either her cronies or they're too scared to stand up to her. Tom, the treasurer, is a good guy, but he's completely spineless. Tom, the treasurer, I repeated, making a note. Does he ever talk about the HOA's finances? Not really, he just rubber stamps whatever Karen wants. This was a dead end, or so I thought. But my conversation with Mark gave me an idea. I reached out to a few of my old Army buddies who lived in the region. One of them, a former intelligence analyst named Rick, now ran a private investigation firm. I hired him for a simple task, a full background and financial check on Karen and every member of the HOA board. It felt extreme, but her actions against my animals had convinced me that no measure was too drastic. While Rick was digging, I started taking a different approach. I began walking the public road that bordered Creekwood Estates every evening, right around the time people got home from work. I didn't go onto their property. I just walked, nodding politely to everyone I saw. It was a subtle psychological move. I was making myself visible, showing them I wasn't some monster hiding behind a fence. I was their neighbor. Some people still averted their eyes, but others started to give small, hesitant waves. A few even stopped their cars to chat, asking about the animals. They were testing the waters, seeing if I was the villain Karen had described. I was always polite, always friendly, I never once brought up the HOA. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One Saturday, an older gentleman was struggling with a lawnmower on his driveway. I walked over and offered to take a look. 20 minutes later, the engine was purring like a kitten. His name was Frank, and it turned out he was a retired forensic accountant. As we talked, he confessed he'd been on the HOA board for a single term 5 years ago, but had quit in disgust over Karen's autocratic style and questionable bookkeeping. She runs the budget like it's her personal piggy bank, he confided, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. There's no transparency. The annual reports are a joke. My ears perked up. Frank, I'm in a bit of a fight with her. I think she's misusing funds, but I can't prove it. He looked around nervously, then beckoned me into his garage. I might have something for you, he whispered. From a dusty box in the corner, he pulled out his old files from his time on the board. He also had copies of the last few years' financial statements that were mailed out to residents. To a layman, they looked fine, but to Frank's trained eye, they were full of red flags. Look at this, he said, pointing to a line item. Community landscaping and beautification. It's nearly 40% of the annual budget, and it's all paid to one vendor, Evergreen Solutions, LLC. The name meant nothing to me, but then Rick's report arrived in my inbox the next day. Evergreen Solutions, LLC, was a landscaping company registered 2 years ago. Its owner and sole proprietor was a man named Gary Peterson. Gary Peterson was Karen's brother-in-law. It was the smoking gun. She was funneling tens of thousands of dollars of HOA dues to her own family for vague, overpriced services. Frank was horrified but also invigorated. He agreed to help me analyze the numbers and prepare a presentation. We now had a coalition. Me, the wrong landowner, Dave, the legal muscle, Mark, the inside source, Rick, the investigator, and Frank, the financial expert. We had evidence of harassment, legal overreach, and now clear-cut financial malfeasance. Karen thought she was fighting a lonely farmer. She had no idea she was about to be ambushed by an entire platoon. The HOA's annual community meeting was scheduled for the first Tuesday in October, held in the sterile, beige-tiled, multi-purpose room of the local library. The primary agenda item, according to the notice Karen had sent out, was a special session to discuss and vote on legal action regarding the agricultural nuisance on the community border. This was her big moment, her public trial where she would be both prosecutor and judge. She intended to whip the residents into a frenzy, secure a vote to fund a massive lawsuit against me, and solidify her power. She had no idea we were about to turn her show trial into a referendum on her own corruption. I arrived with my entire team. Dave, looking sharp and imposing in a dark suit, carried a thick leather briefcase. Frank, the retired accountant, had a folder of his own, filled with spreadsheets and highlighted financial reports. Mark and a half-dozen other residents I had spoken to, including the Millers and the Garcias, came as well, forming a small but solid block of support. We all sat together in the back, a silent, unified presence. Karen was at the front of the room, beaming, standing behind a podium. She opened the meeting with smug pleasantries before launching into her main event. A projector screen flickered to life, displaying a PowerPoint presentation that must have taken her hours. It was a masterclass in propaganda. It featured zoomed-in, unflattering photos of my goats, an ominous-looking red arrow pointing from my farm to their neighborhood on a map, and slides with bold text like health risks and plummeting property values. She used emotional, loaded language, talking about our children's safety and protecting our investment. She spoke of my refusal to cooperate and my blatant disrespect for our community. The narrative was clear. I was the enemy at the gates, and she was their valiant defender. After her 20-minute diatribe, she moved to the final slide. Proposed special assessment, $20,000 for legal retainer to force compliance. She then opened the floor for questions, a confident smirk on her face, clearly expecting a chorus of approval. For a moment, there was silence. Then I stood up. A murmur went through the room. Karen's smirk tightened. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice dripping with venom, "I'm surprised you have the nerve to show your face here. I'm a landowner in this county, and this is a public meeting," I said calmly, my voice carrying easily through the quiet room. "I have a few questions about your presentation. First, could you please show the room the specific county ordinance that my farm is violating? She stammered. It's not about an ordinance. It's about the HOA bylaws. The bylaws of an HOA to which I do not belong, I interrupted smoothly. My property is zoned agricultural residential, a fact I have communicated to you in writing. Are you suggesting the HOA's rules supersede county law? The smirk was gone. We believe we have a strong case for a public nuisance lawsuit. A nuisance that you have failed to prove with anything other than anecdotal claims and blurry photos of my goats, I countered. But let's talk about more concrete matters. Let's talk about the HOA's budget. Before Karen could respond, Frank stood up, holding his folder. I have a question for the board treasurer, Frank said, his voice surprisingly strong. Tom, could you please explain the payments made to a vendor called Evergreen Solutions, LLC? Over the past 2 years, they've received over $70,000 from our dues for beautification services. Yet they are not a registered and insured county contractor, and I can't seem to find any competitive bids for their services as required by our own bylaws. Can you shed some light on that? Tom, the treasurer, turned a pale shade of green. He looked helplessly at Karen. The room was buzzing now. People were whispering, looking from Frank to Karen. The narrative was shifting. Karen grabbed the microphone. That is an internal financial matter and is not relevant to this discussion, she boomed. This is about the farmer. I believe it's very relevant, Frank pressed on, because my research shows that Evergreen Solutions is owned by Gary Peterson. And Gary Peterson, correct me if I'm wrong, Karen is your brother-in-law. The room exploded. The whispers became gasps and angry murmurs. People were on their feet, shouting questions at the board. The carefully constructed image of Karen as the community's protector shattered in an instant. She was a fraud, using their money to enrich her own family. Her face was a mask of pure fury. She banged the gavel on the podium. This meeting is out of order. You are all out of order, she shrieked, her voice cracking. This is a conspiracy. He has brainwashed you. But it was too late. The curtain had been pulled back. Her loyalists looked confused, her critics looked vindicated, and the undecided majority looked utterly disgusted. She had lost control of the room, of the narrative, of everything. We didn't stay for the rest. We had done what we came to do. As we walked out of the library into the cool night air, Dave clapped me on the shoulder. Phase 1 complete, he said with a grim smile. She's wounded and cornered. Now we prepare for Phase 2. The morning after the disastrous HOA meeting was cold and crisp, with a low-lying fog clinging to the fields. It felt like the calm before a storm. At precisely 9 a.m., Dave filed our lawsuit electronically with the county court. It was a comprehensive complaint against the Creekwood Estates Homeowners Association and Karen herself, alleging a campaign of targeted harassment, defamation, abusive process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It also included a motion for a temporary restraining order to halt all fines and collection activities. An hour later, a process server, a big ex-cop with a no-nonsense demeanor, knocked on Karen's front door and served her with the lawsuit. I watched from my porch through a pair of binoculars. I saw her snatch the papers from his hand, her face contorting in disbelief and rage as she slammed the door. It was a small, satisfying moment of victory, but it was just the appetizer. The main course was delivered at 3 p.m. that same day. A different messenger, this one a bonded courier, arrived with a single, legally significant envelope. Inside was the formal, notarized Notice of Lease Non-Renewal. It was written in cold, dispassionate legalese, drafted by Dave to be unassailable. It informed the current lessee of Lot 42, one Karen Miller, that per the terms of the 99-year land lease agreement originally executed in 1925, the landowner was exercising their right not to renew. It clearly stated the lease termination date, 180 days from the date of receipt. It then quoted verbatim Section 12, Paragraph B of the lease agreement, the clause requiring her to vacate the premises and remove all structures at her own expense. And at the very bottom, under the signature line for the landowner/lessor, was my name, printed in clear, bold letters. Marcus Thompson. This was the kill shot Dave had talked about. Not a loud, explosive cannon blast, but a silent, armor-piercing round that would go straight through the hull of her life and detonate inside. I couldn't see her reaction this time, but I could imagine it. The confusion turning to shock, the shock turning to dawning horror as she connected the dots. The man she'd been trying to destroy, the disgusting hillbilly whose goats offended her delicate sensibilities, was the very person who held the ground beneath her feet in the palm of his hand. The sheer, beautiful, poetic justice of it was almost overwhelming. For weeks, she had been weaponizing paperwork against me, bearing me in violation notices and fines based on her flimsy binder of rules. Now she had been undone by a single 100-year-old piece of paper, a document rooted in history, law, and the foresight of my grandfather. Her power was an illusion, built on social pressure and the flimsy authority of an HOA covenant. My power was real, tangible, and recorded in the county courthouse. It was the power of the land itself. The news of the lawsuit spread through Creekwood Estates like wildfire. The HOA's online forum, once Karen's personal echo chamber, descended into chaos. Residents were panicking, furious that Karen's personal vendetta had dragged them all into a costly legal battle. The revelations about her brother-in-law's landscaping company were now common knowledge, and the anger over the financial mismanagement was palpable. In the midst of this firestorm, the notice about her land lease was a private, personal hell reserved just for her. There was no public forum to complain about that. It was a simple, brutal contract between a landowner and a tenant, and she was on the losing end. I knew what would happen next. She would scramble, she would hire a lawyer, she would bluster and threaten and look for a loophole that didn't exist. She had spent her entire tenure as HOA president, believing she was the ultimate authority, the one who dictated the rules of the game. She was about to get a very harsh lesson in the difference between perceived power and actual, legally binding ownership. The fog had burned off, and the afternoon sun was bright on the pasture. Pat and Benatar were basking in the warmth, completely oblivious to the human drama unfolding across the fence. I felt a profound sense of calm settle over me. The trap was sprung. The enemy was in disarray. All I had to do now was wait. Karen's reaction was exactly as Dave had predicted, a frantic, flailing panic. The first sign was a sputtering, all-caps email she sent to me and Dave at 2 in the morning, a long, incoherent screed that accused us of illegal extortion, conspiracy, and un-American tactics. She threatened to sue us into oblivion, to have Dave disbarred, and to see me in jail. Dave's only response was to forward it to the HOA's legal counsel with a short note. You should probably advise your client to cease all direct contact with us. This is not helping her case. Her next move was to hire a hotshot lawyer from a big downtown firm, the kind of guy whose picture is on the side of city buses. He sent Dave a blustering letter demanding we immediately retract the frivolous and unenforceable lease notification. Dave's response was a single package sent by courier, a certified copy of the original lease from the county records office, a copy of the recorded chain of title proving my ownership, and a binder of legal precedents regarding 99-year land leases in our state. The hotshot lawyer went silent after that. We heard through the grapevine he'd dropped her as a client, telling her she had no case and he wouldn't waste his firm's time on it. Meanwhile, the lawsuit against the HOA was proceeding. The discovery process was a nightmare for them. Dave requested every email, every financial record, every meeting minute for the past 5 years. The board, without Karen's blustering to guide them, was in a panic. Tom, the treasurer, buckled under the first deposition, admitting he'd approved the payments to Karen's brother-in-law without seeing a single invoice, simply because Karen had told him to. The other board members, seeing the writing on the wall, began to distance themselves from her, claiming they had been misled. A formal recall petition was started by Mark and Frank, and it gained signatures at a shocking speed. More than 70% of the homeowners signed it within a week. Karen was officially and humiliatingly removed as president and stripped of her board seat. Her reign was over. Defeated on the legal and community fronts, she tried her last resort, the court of public opinion. She contacted a reporter at the local news station, spinning a sob story about a powerful developer, me, using a legal loophole to kick a helpless grandmother out of her home. The reporter, a young, ambitious woman named Jessica, called me for a comment. Instead of a comment, I invited her to the farm. I walked her through the entire story, showing her the binder. I showed her the violation notices, the threatening emails, the Facebook posts, the police report. I introduced her to Frank, who walked her through the financial evidence of Karen's self-dealing. I introduced her to the Millers, who told her about being forced to replace their lawn. The story Jessica wrote was not the one Karen had pitched. The headline was, HOA president sued for harassment, accused of embezzlement, faces eviction from land owned by her victim. It was a devastating, meticulously researched piece that laid the entire sordid affair bare. It painted Karen not as a victim, but as a petty tyrant who had finally been brought to justice by the very man she had tried to ruin. Her carefully constructed world wasn't just crumbling, it had been leveled, and the rubble was being sifted through on the 6 o'clock news. With every passing week, as the 180-day deadline on her eviction notice ticked down, she became more and more isolated. Her old allies on the board wouldn't take her calls. Her neighbors crossed the street to avoid her. The house, once her castle and the symbol of her status, was now just a building on borrowed time, a monument to her spectacular downfall. Her power had been derived entirely from the perception of others. Once that perception was shattered, she had nothing left. She was just a woman in a beige house, waiting for an eviction date. I took no joy in her misery, but I felt a deep, abiding satisfaction in the restoration of order. She had created a world of chaos and fear, and she was now suffering the consequences. The land, my grandfather's legacy, was quiet. The animals were safe. The war was effectively over. All that remained was the final unconditional surrender. The days on the calendar bled away, and soon there was only a week left before the lease expired. The for sale sign that had been hopefully pounded into Karen's front lawn a few months ago had long since been removed. No one wanted to buy a house that they would have to physically move. The bank had repossessed her white SUV. Her perfectly manicured lawn was now overgrown with weeds, a visible sign of her complete capitulation. I hadn't spoken to her since the day of the public meeting. I had no desire to. But one afternoon, as I was mending a section of fence, I saw her standing in her backyard, staring across the property line at my barn. She looked smaller, diminished, the vibrant floral prints she used to wear replaced by a drab, gray sweatsuit. Some part of me, the part that had seen too much misery in the world, felt a flicker of something akin to pity. It was quickly extinguished by the memory of the oily sheen in the animal's water trough. Against my better judgment, I put down my tools and walked over to the fence line, the same spot where she had delivered her initial threat what felt like a lifetime ago. I didn't say anything, just stood there. She turned her head, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "You must be very proud of yourself," she said, her voice raspy, devoid of its former commanding tone. "I'm not proud," I replied honestly. "I'm just tired. This whole thing was unnecessary." "Unnecessary?" she scoffed, a spark of the old Karen flaring up. "I was trying to maintain standards. I was trying to build a beautiful, respectable community. And you and your stinking animals, you ruined it. You brought this down on yourself." I stared at her, truly seeing the depth of her delusion for the first time. There was no remorse, no self-awareness. In her mind, she was still the victim, the noble queen whose perfect kingdom had been spoiled by a peasant who wouldn't follow her rules. It was never about the smell, or the property values, or the community. It was about control. My existence, independent and outside of her control, was an affront she could not tolerate. "My family was on this land before a single house in your community was ever built," I said, my voice flat and even. "This land has its own standards, Karen. They have to do with hard work, respecting your neighbors, and minding your own business. You failed on all three counts. You didn't just pick a fight with me. You picked a fight with the history of this place, and the history won." I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there by the fence. There was nothing more to say. The day the lease officially expired was a Tuesday. As per Dave's meticulous plan, I had arranged for everyone to be there. A professional land surveyor arrived at 8 a.m. to formally restake the boundaries of the lot. At 9 a.m., a crew from a structural, moving and demolition company I had hired pulled up in their heavy trucks. And at 9:15 a.m., 2 sheriff's deputies arrived to keep the peace and oversee the transfer of property. I had the court order, the expired lease, and my deed. Everything was legal, official, and final. Karen was still there. She stood on her front porch, wrapped in a bathrobe, screaming that we were trespassing, that this was her house. The lead deputy, a calm professional sergeant, walked up her steps and explained the situation to her in simple terms. The land lease was terminated. She no longer had a legal right to be on the property. She was, as of that moment, trespassing. She refused to move. So with quiet efficiency, the deputies escorted her off the porch. They didn't put her in handcuffs, but their hands were firmly on her arms as they walked her to the edge of the driveway, past the property line she had so often lorded over. She continued to shriek, a wild, pathetic tirade against me, the deputies, the world. A few neighbors had come out to watch, their faces a mixture of pity and awe. This was the final, public humiliation. The queen, deposed and exiled from her own castle, left with nothing but the clothes on her back and a legacy of her own making. As her son arrived in a beat-up sedan to pick her up, I gave the foreman of the demolition crew a nod. "Take it down," I said. The resonant clang of heavy machinery starting up was the final sound of her reign ending. With Karen gone, a strange quiet fell over Creekwood Estates. The lawsuit was quickly settled. The HOA's insurance company, eager to stop the bleeding, paid a handsome sum for damages and all our legal fees. The new board, with Frank elected as president and Mark as vice president, was a breath of fresh air. Their first official act was to pass a resolution formally apologizing to my family. Their second was to draft and ratify a new set of bylaws with strict checks and balances, term limits for board members, and transparent financial oversight to ensure that no one could ever again accumulate and abuse power the way Karen had. The community began to heal. The fear that had permeated the neighborhood dissipated, replaced by a renewed sense of neighborliness. People started talking to each other again. The Millers put in a small vegetable garden, and no one said a word about it. The Garcias bought their daughter a new swing set, this one even brighter yellow than the last. The changes were small, but they were profound. The biggest question was what to do with Lot 42. Once her house was demolished and the debris cleared, it was just an empty plot of land, a scar on the otherwise perfect suburban landscape. I could have sold it to the highest bidder. I could have built another house on it. But that didn't feel right. That land had become a symbol of something more. One evening, I invited Frank, Mark, and a few of the other neighbors over to my porch. I laid out a sketch on the picnic table. It was a simple design for a small community park with a vegetable garden, a playground, and a few benches. "I own the land," I told them, "but I want to build this with you. I want to turn the piece of ground that was the source of so much conflict into a place that brings people together." Their reaction was overwhelming. The next Saturday, a small army of volunteers from Creekwood Estates showed up at my gate. My veteran buddies came too, bringing skills, tools, and a can-do attitude that could build a bridge or a playground with equal ease. We worked side by side, digging, planting, and building. The sound of hammers and laughter replaced the memory of Karen's shouting. People who had been pitted against each other by her toxic leadership were now sharing shovels and swapping stories. We were literally and figuratively rebuilding the community on the ground where the tyrant once stood. Months later, the park was complete. We named it Founder's Garden, in honor of my grandfather and the original spirit of the land. The kids from the neighborhood filled the playground with shrieks of joy. The elderly, including the Millers, tended to the vegetable plots, their hands in the rich soil. On a warm summer evening, Sarah and I sat on one of the benches, watching the sun set behind my barn. The goats were grazing peacefully in their pasture. The gentle hum of the neighborhood, kids playing, a distant lawnmower, the murmur of conversation, was the only sound. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and contentment. It didn't smell like a pigsty. It smelled like home. It smelled like peace. A hard-won, deeply satisfying peace that came from standing your ground, fighting for what's right, and discovering that sometimes the best way to defeat a tyrant is to help her neighbors build a garden in her place. The land endured, as it always does, and now so did the community.